Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcasts with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Future Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Juliette Lamar, and joining us today is Christopher Brown. He is the author of Tropic of Kansas, which is a dystopian novel that was a finalist for the 2018 Campbell Awards for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. He is also a technology lawyer. He is a man of many, many talents, and we're very excited to have him on today. So welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Juliette. Delighted to be here.
Oh, absolutely. Well, let's dive right into Tropic of Kansas. Give people a little bit of an overview about the book and maybe why it's such a hit in our present day.
Well, Tropic of Kansas is it's kind of a dystopian road trip through a sort of distorted mirror America. It's the story of a brother and sister trapped in a United States that's kind of falling apart and strained by political tensions that are finally breaking it into multiple pieces and trying to find their way through this sort of darkening time to a better future. The book opens when a young teenager, a 17-year-old who is has been rendered a fugitive due to the political activities of his parents, who's been on the run in Canada. He gets deported back to the U.S., a U.S. that's been walled off from the other side, put in a detention camp basically for kids, from which he escapes and finds himself on the run, trying to navigate through the Tropic of Kansas of the title, which is a kind of a part of the middle of the U.S., a sort of part of the American heartland that's gone a little bit third world, in a country in which a charismatic CEO has become a kind of fascist American president. His sister, a government lawyer, is tagged to go hunt him down, and they finally find themselves together in the sort of revolutionary sanctuary of New Orleans. And the book, among other things, has gotten some attention for, being deemed prescient for some of these things. It's not a little bit like they're ripped straight from the headlines of today, even though I wrote the book in sort of 2012 to 2014. And sort of proof, I suppose, that it's sort of like my colleague William Gibson likes to say that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, or maybe the dystopia is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
It's so interesting how that works out. You write this book that now has so many close ties to the actual real headlines that are happening. Where did you draw your inspiration?
I think it's just, science fiction. I think of, on the one hand, it's imaginative conjuring. I think to do a good job, it's just going to draw from the things you see in the world around you, the things that are there, but maybe not getting as much emphasis. I mean, thinking about the idea of the CEO president, that's not a really particularly new idea. It was it's one that, especially among certain segments of the electorate, has been popular for a long time. The idea that to be a great qualification to run a country would be to have run a big company, and we saw that with sort of both Presidents Bush. We saw it with Mitt Romney and a host of others, both at the presidential and at the gubernatorial level. And I thought that was an interesting idea because I've also worked as a corporate lawyer inside companies where I worked with CEOs and worked in boardrooms. And, the idea of running a country like a company is interesting because, companies typically don't work as democracies. They work as dictatorships, maybe sometimes benevolent ones. But so I wanted to play with that idea. And similarly, the idea of this Tropic of Kansas, of sort of the parts of America that have gone a little third world. I mean, that's just, sort of based on reporting what I see as I drive around the country. And there are parts of, I think, kind of the American heartland that have been a little bit left behind, and I think we're increasingly cognizant of that. But maybe a few years ago we weren't so much, and I think science fiction provides a useful way to think about those things by kind of altering the mix a little bit and kind of putting a mirror up to reality, maybe a funhouse mirror that distorts things a little bit, to provide us a way to maybe think about those issues and at the same time hopefully tell a compelling story.
It's so true, the funhouse mirror analogy, because there's a lot of things that we see and they're right in front of our face. Like you were saying, that the CEO as president, is not just with Trump, it's with a lot of other presidents we've seen have that same kind of mindset. And then with parts of our country becoming third world, these are right in front of our faces, but we're refusing to acknowledge them because potentially they're not what we want to see.
Yeah, they may not conform to the narrative we had in mind. And, the idea of thinking about revolution, in the context of American politics. And, we live in a country where, we have a revolutionary creation myth. And yet at the same time, talking about those kinds of things, you can kind of see them, burbling around at the margins of our political discourse, and they're pretty scary. But like, in the discussions around issues related to the Second Amendment, it's just kind of right there, like the third rail of American politics. And so the idea to me of taking, what if the kinds of things that are happening in, Syria or Egypt or Venezuela were happening here. And I think, science fiction is a great tool to do that. And I think doing those kinds of exercises can be both a lot of fun from a sort of, literary and storytelling point of view, and hopefully provocative in terms of ideas and sort of thinking about things a little bit differently.
And so in your mind right now, I know you've got a couple things coming out soon. What's kind of on the horizon?
What's on the horizon technologically or politically or otherwise?
I guess, as from your perspective and your point of view, I know you've got a book coming out quite soon that might be dealing with some issues. What are you really channeling at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. The book I have coming out next year, working title is Rule of Capture. It'll be coming out next summer or fall from Harper Collins, and it's a book about a lawyer in an American society in which the very rule of law is sort of under attack, while at the same time it's a country, a circumstance in which there's immense pressure kind of coming up in the population for kind of rethinking the whole legal system, as it were. The elevator pitch for that book is Better Call Saul meets 1984, which you kind of get, gives you an image. But in terms of the things that I think, that I see as I'm working on this book, it really is a great question. This issue of American decline that I think we're all struggling with, the way in which, as I look from my, sitting here in the trailer in the front yard that I use as my office, looking out into the world, I see, the way in which the U.S. Is sort of changing politically and sort of walking away from the dominant position it's had since the end of World War II. You can think of that as a decline, or think of that as isolationism, or you can think of it as an assertion of sovereignty. Different people have different views, but in my book, I imagine that essentially the U.S. is sort of lost a war with China and is sort of struggling to get back on its feet. And to me, that's a powerful metaphor for what it's like when you kind of walk away from the victory on which you had, built a kind of almost imperial power. And I think the sort of the other thing that that's really going on in this book is this pressure kind of from all political sides to kind of relook at the constitutional and political system and sort of look at whether it needs a kind of a reboot. And those ideas are dealt with in Tropic of Kansas as well. But, if you think about the fact that our Constitution was written in the 1780s in a period when, to get a message to the next town, required somebody to travel on horseback for a chunk of the day. And with a much smaller population, with an essentially agrarian society, while there's great genius to the structure of government, it's one that has to constantly evolve and change. And I think the pressure for, on the one hand, I think a sense among a lot of people to have something that looks more like direct democracy, a more authentically participatory system, a kind of pressure we've seen throughout American history, and one that I think network computing and modern telecommunications technologies really amp up the pressure for that. At the same time, as I think people see a kind of a profound desire for authority to be imposed, kind of looking at it from another angle, and a pressure for, a sort of a rule of law that's pretty hard and black and white, and that tries to use law to maintain a certain sense of order that's anchored in the past and anchored in an idea of what the country looks like that I think, you could argue is anachronistic. So those kinds of tensions I'm playing with in the system, and the ways in which some, technologies are used as instruments of, those different modes of trying to restructure, social and economic life.
Absolutely. So, Christopher, how did you find yourself as an author? What really brought you to this point where you are now really, really considered a top-level author?
Well, I mean, it's something I've always done. I've been doing it, since not long after I got out of college, and I think science fiction in particular, for someone with my interests, which include both literary interests and interests in storytelling, as well as interests in sort of big ideas and kind of thinking about what the future looks like, or even just sort of trying to think in counterintuitive ways about what the present looks like. It's a really compelling way to do that. It's not something that you can, you can't. I mean, maybe there are now, but certainly when I was coming up, there weren't really places you could go to train to be a science fiction writer. And I think really to learn to be any kind of a writer, the best qualification is to live a rich and interesting life and kind of see the world through a lot of different windows and through a lot of different angles. And but I've been fortunate, especially since I moved to Austin, Texas in the late 90s, to be part of a community of science fiction writers and to participate in workshops where groups of writers get together and sort of hone their craft. And that's really sort of where I've, kind of learned the most about the kind of yeoman craft part of the process. And then, you sort of plug away, and it's, drawing by sitting down at the typewriter and kind of looking at the world around you and trying to put it through that sort of prismatic lens is how you come up with a what hopefully is a compelling novel-length story for people to read.
Mm-hmm. And you weren't always. We touched on this briefly. You weren't always an author. You have also been a technology lawyer, which is a very, very interesting field to be in. Let's talk a little bit about green futures. This sparked my interest when you and I were chatting earlier.
Yeah, I mean, so and I've been very interested for a long time in maybe a different way of thinking about what constitutes a green future, or how do we get to a green future. I mean, we live in the age that many are now calling the Anthropocene, the age of sort of in which nature sort of is predominantly created or conditioned or modified by human domination of the planet. And in our ways of thinking about what a green future looks like, we tend to focus on it kind of as an engineering problem. We talk a lot about, sustainability in terms of, figuring out new ways to generate energy, figuring out new ways to conserve energy, figuring out ways to cause less damage to the planet. And all of those things are very important. But we don't think a lot about is sort of the very idea of nature. And the idea of nature is being separate and apart from us. And the idea versus the idea that, wait, there really is no separation between us and nature, especially if we're living in the Anthropocene, epoch of planetary geological history, one in which, human existence and nature are the same thing. And so I've been playing around with ways of kind of obliterating that barrier. I've done it in my own domicile, where I've been doing a project for the last decade together with my family, where we have constructed a home in a former petroleum pipeline brownfield, in which we have designed a house that's basically like a buried hobbit house from the future. The premises of which is to share the entirety of our habitat with some limits with all of the other species around us. We've planted done a kind of a 1 acre restoration of the kinds of biodiverse plant ecology that was here before European settlement, the Blackburn Prairie, working with the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And that's brought back all manner of bizarre and interesting insects, and then lizards and reptiles, and even mammalian life and bird life, and kind of this almost Edenic avatar-like environment. And it's kind of a model and a proving ground for ways of integrating wild nature back into the fabric of the city. And I think it's just one of many, many projects you see around the world like that, where people are looking at ways to say, hey, this skyscraper can be part of green nature. You can integrate green roof elements into it. You can hang vines off of the side of it. You can intentionally create habitat. I live in Austin, Texas, where one of the landmarks is a bridge downtown, which happens to have been constructed in a manner in which the sort of under beams have these apertures that are the perfect width to provide roosts during the daytime for the Mexican free-tailed bat. So they're the largest bat colony in the world. And these other projects I'm talking about are sort of examples of saying, well, what if you did things like that to create habitat for other species within the urban environment on purpose? And I think doing those things takes the idea of a green future to a whole different level, and also has the potential to really, ignite urban life with a kind of greater sense of wonder.
And are you seeing more and more interest in this green future as opposed to earlier times in our history?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think the idea of bringing the wild into the city is really a very 21st century thing, and partly it's a function of the way in which, especially in the North American context, many species are, increasingly adapted to coexistence with human urban environments. I guess the number one most dense population of peregrine falcons in the world, or at least in the Western Hemisphere now, is apparently New York City. And throughout the world, and throughout the great cities of the world, there's this great emphasis on restoring urban rivers. If you go to Munich, Germany, for example, they've taken 6 miles of the Isar River there, running through downtown Munich, a river that I spent a lot of time around when I was younger, and it was kind of a almost industrialized canal, this sort of black channel, neglected, just this thing where, as in most industrialized parts of the Western world, water was treated almost like waste, right? And they have like completely restored it to be as close as possible to the way it was before there was even a city there, with kind of natural shorelines. They've controlled the intake so that what goes into that part of the river is cleaner. All of these native plants along either side and kind of natural shoals. And it's the most amazing thing. You go there and like summertime at lunch, everybody runs out of their downtown offices and they're out, swimming in the wild river. And it could be, 2,000 years in the past for all you would know. In the same way, every places from, Los Angeles to Houston, they're doing similar things here. And so I think there are a lot of these things going on. And I think the generation coming up, I think is a lot more attuned to the importance of integrating our connection with the natural world into everyday life. You even see it in projects like the High Line in New York. That's really an example of, the greening of the city, one that you can just see by its success, how intuitively and dramatically people connect with those ideas when you implement them well.
Absolutely. Christopher, just for our audience, what is the best way to connect with you, to follow what you're up to, and to purchase your books when they come out?
Yeah, well, you can find me online at ChristopherBrown.com, and I'm on Twitter at NB_Chris. And that's kind of my main social media platform. And I'm also on several other platforms, and all of those are listed through my website, which again is ChristopherBrown.com.
Fantastic. Well, Christopher, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you again for coming on and sharing your wisdom and insight and your unique outlook on our world today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Juliet. It was delightful.
That is Christopher Brown. He's the author of Tropic of Kansas. You can find his book on his website and on Amazon. It's all over the place. Definitely check it out, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been Juliet Lamar with Future Tech Podcast.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.